Tell me how you learn. That's the motto of our podcast series, in which people share their personal experience, tips, and insights on learning. So today I'm excited because we have someone here who is an organizational learning and development practitioner with over 20 years experience and who will explain to us why it is time to stop training. Welcome, Joe. I'm so excited that you're here with me today.
Thank you, Cinnamon. The pleasure is mine to be with you.
So great to have you. I have a quote here from you that maybe best describes the way you think and how truly groundbreaking I think this is. You said, if we really want to help individuals learn and perform better, we need to stop relying on a course or workshop and focus instead our efforts on when, where, and how people do their work, and that it's all about the entire work ecosystem. And formal learning makes up only a very small percentage of it. Could you maybe tell me why you think it is time to stop formal training and how we can improve the way we think about it and learning and development?
Absolutely. And so I will start off by saying that I'm guilty of what I'm saying at this point, is that for the first half of my career, I did these things. And one of the things that I always saw that was lacking was the actual performance improvement of the individual, the actual application of knowledge. And so, I put on those courses, I put on those workshops, and you could see that they understood it through tests and practices and things like that. And if you were fortunate, you could go out and actually see them apply it. But then what happens is that when they get into their actual workflow, they're presented with other challenges. There's other things that's going on in their work ecosystem that weren't part of that training. And this is not to fault anybody who, like myself, was an instructional designer and a trainer. You just can't plan for all of those things in a training session. And so we have to kind of recognize the limits of what training can do, and then focus more about, okay, what's happening now in that flow of that workflow for that individual? What's going on in that work ecosystem, and how do we now help to make sure that that individual continuously improves performance? So it's changing our mindset from this idea of, I'm going to build a course, I'm going to build a workshop, and that's it, to much more about that course or workshop might be the start of that process, but it's certainly not the end. It's, okay, now let's follow those learners, those workers out to their workflow and understand a little bit more about some of those things that are going on for them when they're actually on the job. So therefore, we can build the right resources for them at that moment of need, and probably improve that training as well for the next new hires that come along, as an example.
Exactly. So if I think of workshops or courses, I mean, most of them could only be like once a year, twice a year, and that's a very punctual thing. It's just one day or a couple of days, and time is moving so fast, and the development, digital transformation just requires skills almost like on the go. You have to learn so much, and I also think you can't cover all of that just by conducting a training a few times per year. So I totally agree with you that it's a workflow, or it should be something that is quite agile or just flowing with whatever is needed.
Absolutely.
In an earlier talk that we had together, you mentioned the book Brain Rules by John Medina, and I wanted to refer to that. He was a development molecular biologist. And there are a few statements that caught my attention, such as, every brain is wired differently. We don't pay attention to boring things. We are powerful and natural explorers. And the last one that I found really inspirational was, vision trumps all other senses. So how could that translate in current ways of learning and development, or especially learning methods?
So when we think about, like, with Dr. Medina, and he's written a number of things, and one of the things that was very poignant to me when I read, Brain Rules series, is that, he basically postulates that, there's over 7 billion people in the world. So there's 7 billion different ways of learning, and that you can't really lump people into a category or into a couple categories. And we understand that learning myths are just really that, it's a myth, or learning styles are a myth. And so it was refreshing to see him talk about, again, science doesn't understand how it is you and I pick up a glass the way that we do. or how we learn the way that we do. So they're making headway into that. But one of the things that he talks about in this book is that most of these studies, when we talk about learning, less than 40% of them can ever be duplicated. And so when you think about that, these studies are generally taking place in the classroom, whether that be in an elementary, secondary, or post-secondary school. So you imagine that probably the duplicability of a study that was done in a corporate environment is probably even significantly less than that. So it kind of dispels some of the myths or the science that I and many of my peers have bought into with regards to learning, because you say, okay, well, maybe that's not that could be duplicated in a certain environment. Do I have that environment here? And that's one of the things that I've been talking about with my peers is that when you're kind of looking at those studies, you need to understand what was the lens that scientist was looking through. Was it educational? Was it psychological? Was it social, as an example? And then where was that study done? And when you start looking at that, you realize that it's kind of a very small lens in a very contained environment of which some of those theories came out of. And so you have to kind of step back from that and go, okay, well, maybe there's some applicability with regards to, some of those studies and things like that. But now I have to kind of take that into the larger context of my work environment, of the workers and things like that, to say, are there things that I could apply from that, but maybe not the entire model? One of the things that he also talks about is that we as a species are really very early in our evolution, which sounds kind of strange when we think about the digital transformation era. But, he points out it was not too long ago that we were hunters and gatherers, and so that our brains are really still catching up. We're still kind of lagging behind some of the technology that we've actually developed at this point in terms of how to now adapt to that, use it, and make it part of our everyday life, which sounds kind of strange for most of us. But,
yes, it does.
Yeah.
It's like we have to catch up with the technology that we invented ourselves.
That's exactly what he's saying. He goes, and what he kind of gets back to is that the way that we best learn is that when we're put into, basically, I'm going to utilize his terminology, is basically the way we learn best is when we're put into an unstable environment with unstable, ecosystem around us. And it's through a series of trial and error, so to go back to that hunter-gatherer stage, if you were out hunting a saber-toothed tiger, you don't want to make that mistake in that regards. But you think about that is that even today with, many people being in the corporate world, there's still that sense of what I'm doing is really for my survival so that I may earn my paycheck, so that I could put food on my table and things like that. So that mindset hasn't really left us that much. That's the fundamental driver. So understanding from a learning perspective is that people need to be able to now experience that in their actual day, in their work. So getting back to the workflow idea is how they learn best. And that really is through that sense of vision. What do I see in front of me that I now need to process in order to now continue to move forward or do what it is I'm doing? So that's kind of some of the ideas that he's putting forward is that, the eyes play tricks on the brain. In terms of what we're seeing, how are we now processing what's in front of us?
How do you think could that translate into learning management platform or learning experience platform as they are referred to today? Are they already providing this way of learning that you can get that stimulation visually or in other ways that he's referring to?
I struggle with this when we talk about learning management systems or learning experience platforms, learning experience design, is that when you really think about that in the end, we're still designing that environment. We're still designing that learning, right? So in some ways, it actually goes against what Dr. Medina is saying is that you can't really design the experience for the individual because that individual has that experience. That's the personalization part of learning, is that individual going through that experience and having those aha moments. One of the things that I do struggle with, as an example, when we talk about learning experience platforms or learning management systems, is that what we're asking that learner to do is leave their workflow to go somewhere else to learn, right? And so I've implemented over 7 learning management systems in my career. And that struggle from early 2000 to now 2022 has always still been the same. It's you're constantly in a kind of a sales mode to get people to come and use your technology. And the underlying problem is you're asking them to leave what they're doing. their work, right? The
Yes.
survivability part, to now go to that learning experience platform or that learning management system when we now have the technology in front of us that we can now integrate into their workflow with tools like Yammer and Slack and Microsoft Teams and Google Space, Office Space, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I try to kind of say to people is, the learning management system, the LXP, is fine, but it's only part of the picture. It's not the center of the learning universe for that worker. The center of the learning universe for that worker is where they're working. We have to think about also the accessibility part. So if I'm a desk worker, and certainly I've worked in finance and insurance and technology, most people that I'm aware of had 5 or 6 software applications at a time, and now you're asking them to open up another one. And I've also worked in manufacturing where the only technology they had access to was the technology that was part of the equipment that they were actually working. So they weren't going to go to an LMS or an LXP because you couldn't take them out of the workflow because, again, they're producing. So
Yeah.
I think, and I, like I said before, I'm guilty of this. I bought a lot of LMSs. I researched a lot of LMSs and LXPs in my lifetime. And I just always caution my peers is that you can't look at that as the solution, as the quick fix. No matter what the vendor says is, yes, we can do all these things. Yeah, I'm sure you can. But the question is, are people still going to go and use it? And that's the part we all have to ask ourselves is, what is the usage of those tools by our workforce versus what they're using? And I think you're going to find that those numbers are fairly low, especially once you kind of remove, for instance, the yearly compliance or required learning.
Mm-hmm.
Usage of those tools gets very small. So let's accept the fact that those are not well used, and let's look at some of the other technologies that our workers are using and integrate into that workflow.
I understand. Is there a way that, for example, artificial intelligence or virtual reality tools could come into place then more and more in the future?
I think there could. From a virtual reality standpoint, and I've been just kind of trying to research this now from a manufacturing standpoint, is that if you could set up that individual in a virtual reality environment using that equipment, certainly at the time that you now introduce them to the equipment and they're actually running that equipment, there's probably going to be a much shorter learning curve for them because they've now actually played in a safe space.
Exactly.
In regards to that. The AI part, I'm still a little confused on because there's been a number of people who have talked about some of the dangers of AI in terms of what those algorithms are doing and the results that they return to you. And one of the discussions I was in a panel not too long ago when we were talking about AIs is that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, okay, what resources is that intelligence actually pulling for that individual? And secondly, does it fit within context? And I'm sure you've experienced, I have, you type something into Google or Safari, and you're doing a search and you get, 10 results, but maybe only 2 of them are close to what it was you wanted. So that artificial intelligence, it's a back and forth kind of relationship where it's trying to determine what it is you want. But still, even in the end, in some cases, especially when we talk about, corporate learning, is you have to kind of now modify what it was you just read to make it fit within the context of your work.
But is that then not still an argument to say, okay, we need AI or we will use it more and more in the future, but it's still the people or the human beings who decide what to do with this information, what to do with the search results or the results that AI gives?
Yeah, and that's the part, is that you can kind of get into this when you start looking at the data in terms of the type of information that they're pulling, that AI is actually delivering to them. What are they now doing with that information? As an example. So, I did a study not too long ago, and I saw that there was a big pull from certain divisions within the organization with regards to agile leadership. But that tells me the start of the story. So there's an interest in agile leadership. Now we, as learning development professionals, got to go dig in and say, okay, well, what are you trying to do with this topic? So now how do we build a structure around the idea of agile leadership that fits within the context of our organization? And that's the big challenge is that I don't know that AI has evolved far enough to understand the contextual environment of our organizations to deliver the right context. And I also kind of caveat all that with the example of many organizations still don't allow employees to access certain technology. So, for instance, Facebook. I've never worked for an organization that allowed you to access Facebook
Mm-hmm.
Or
Me
Twitter
either.
as an example.
Yes.
Instagram, TikTok. So if you start thinking about some of those primary sources that people might use for information, they're doing that on their own outside of the organizational structure through their cell phones or at home or whatever they may be doing. So you're missing out on a great deal of where those workers are actually getting information from to put into the context of how do we now build a learning ecosystem around this idea, because you're not seeing a lot of the work that they're doing with regards to how they're trying to improve themselves.
So, do you mean that people who go onto social media platforms and do a type like they learn there as well, let it be YouTube as well, that they do it on their own free time because it's not wanted by organizational structure, and that this is a missed opportunity, that it should be maybe more taken into account?
Yeah. So let me give you a great example. And I haven't noticed this probably in the past 2 or 3 years, but I certainly remember it from the previous 15 or 17. So we all work in adult learning. But if I went and typed in a search for a particular site, I wanted to go look up an article or something. And when that site information was read by our internal organization browser, and the information, if the word adult was in there, that site got blocked.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because again, the site, and the algorithm, the technology behind it is reading adult, and it might be it's thinking obviously something in much different context than the idea of adult learning. It just saw adult and it stopped it. So now, certainly in my, previous years, that means that if I wanted to go look at the Association of Talent Development or another adult learning site as an example of that, I had to do that off hours, or I did it on my cell phone as an example to pull that resource in. But if I were using that resource, now I've got to do all the legwork to now copy and paste and share that information because I can't link to that resource. I can't link to that video or wherever it may be from an internal document or whatever I may be doing to that external resource, because all those workers are going to get blocked from seeing it as well.
I understand. That brings me to the next point, learning culture. I mean, the term, we hear it so often lately that you could kind of assume it is a new buzzword. When it comes to learning culture, is that something, in your opinion, that should change, that organizations or companies should open themselves or get more flexible when it comes to new ways of learning or getting information?
Yeah. So it's funny. I just got through writing I'm actually in the middle of writing some articles about learning culture because I've been seeing these workshops and the webinars and things like that. And one of the things that I thought was missing from a lot of that dialogue was really the understanding of your organization. So a lot of these webinars or workshops are like, well, here's how you go about building that learning culture. One of the things that I saw as missing within that is the understanding of the culture that you work in. And so I'll give you a great example. Several years ago, I was actually brought into an organization during my consulting years, and they wanted to implement the ideas of design thinking, lean startup, and agile. And I'd had practice in that with some previous employers. And so I'm now building the framework around actually doing that. And we started doing workshops and things like that. And we're building up enthusiasm and energy within the organization because people are around now ready to kind of open up themselves to this innovation and creative thinking and, failing fast and failing forward and things like that. But in the end, the organization, especially the executives, were still very much what's referred to as command and control. They were saying, here's how we're going to do things. So that culture was always going to beat or trump the culture that I was trying to create from a learning standpoint, because the executive team was not in support of being led from the bottom up in the sense of agile or in the sense of lean startup. So I'm not saying you can't create a learning culture in an environment like that. You have to recognize the culture that exists and work within that to start making a change. So, if the culture today is we're all about processes and quality improvements and lean and Six Sigma, then work within the context of creating creative thought and process around the existing culture And you kind of have to be a little slower with regards and diligent in the same regards with thinking through, how do I now want to move this to a much more innovative, fail fast, be agile type of culture away from where we're at today. Because you're just not going to be able to do that, because I had this thought of doing it today. And that was my hard lesson learned with that company many years ago.
So you kind of need the buy-in of the CEOs or of top down?
Absolutely.
This is
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. You have to kind of understand where they're at, so part of it is, again, how do they want to lead? So if I were to go back in time as an example of this, so if I went back to GE in the 1990s and Jack Welch is CEO. So at that time, he's leading, it's all about quality improvement. So he's leading Lean and Six Sigma and 5S and all these things. And it's about quality and process. And it worked for them at that time, right? They experienced great growth. Jeff Illett comes in the early 2000s, and GE's starting to get beat up by its competition because they're stuck in working with the Lean and Six Sigma, and they're not innovating. They're not creating. They're not opening themselves up to new opportunities for commercial products. So Jeff Illett basically comes in and says, all right, we're going to change some of the ways that we're doing things. So if I were that person that's trying to create a learning culture between those 2 decades, as an example, you're working the learning culture in one mindset, understanding where the CEO of the executive team is in the 90s, and then you're switching gears for the early 2000s because, again, now you're switching based on competition. So you have to kind of understand where that organization is, where the executives are, where they're kind of pointing that ship to. Say, okay, now that I want to implement this culture, how do I do it? The other part around this, again, is understanding how people work and what they work with. So I'll go back to the example that I shared before. If I was working in technology or finance, where everybody has access to, multiple software, in manufacturing, they don't. So the idea of me, for instance, with one organization, we had Yammer. In there, I was able to create probably over 25 different type of learning channels with that tool within that organization. I couldn't do that in a manufacturing environment because nobody had access to it. So you have to kind of think through, as that culture is, what are those practices that are going to work? And in some cases, it's going to be multiple practices, because you might have a group of people who are always on the computer, technology, finance, whatever it may be. And you could do some things there with some of the tools I talked about. But with that manufacturing group, you've got to work differently. Now it's much more about personal interaction, meetups and things like that, daily huddles and things called hip pocket training that you actually have to. So you have to kind of modify. It's not a one size fits all, I think, is what I'm trying to say, is you've got to kind of modify with the different groups within your organization to figure out what fits to move everybody towards that idea of a learning culture that's being led from the bottom up.
So just because you referred to the past and now how it is nowadays, but if we look into the future, what do you think, how could learning look in the future?
I think that what we've seen over the past 5 or 7 years is kind of the taste of what our learning is going to look like in the future. I think if you look around at the technology that the generations around us, the millennials and the Gen Zs, as an example, the technology that they're using is probably a taste of what your learning looks like in the future. And I'll give you a great example of that. I recently was with an employer, a client, I should say, and I introduced the use of TikTok as a form of learning. And so what I actually did is we wanted to understand from a cultural standpoint how people actually apply those cultural values in their everyday work. And then I also asked the different locations to share a best practice with me. And so I did, from my effort, it was much more, I was focused of, I want you to tell me how you actually practice this cultural value, and I want you to share with me your best practices around a particular operation, because I just wanted to see how that feedback came in their response rate. So as an example of that, within 1 week, I had over 40 videos. Within 1 month, I had over 130.
From the employees?
From the employees.
Oh,
so
wow.
They're pulling out their phones, they're pulling out their tablets, they're recording at their computers. So there was this great energy from employees who wanted to share what was in their head, what they had learned, what they had practiced, but they weren't given that venue to do it. And what it allowed the organization and I to do was now step back and look at those top performers and identify those best practices with regards to cultural values or certain operational processes or things like that. Now you've got this great opportunity to enhance your training and all facets, because now you're seeing how they're working. They're sharing with you, here's how we do this. Here's what, here's how we lead. Here's our best practices. And you're able to now gather that information and now, compile that into what can be various resources for people, whether that be a training class, a workshop, and or the resources that they may need at that moment of need. But more importantly is that when you're sharing those resources, their peers are now seeing people that they're going to see who are talking about these best practices that they do. And of course, now they're engaged because it's not me up there telling them how to do it.
It's
somebody Exactly. So I think our learning in the future, I would be very surprised, and I'll say it, disappointed if we are still having conversations about courses and workshops 10 years from now, because that means we won't have gotten as far as we probably should have with regards to where we need to be with learning and development, considering the continuous transformation of the organizations and business in and of itself. That if we're still having the same dialogue that we've been having in the last 20 years about ROI and courses and workshops as we've been having, and again, guilty of it. So, and I've been part of those conversations.
Naturally.
I hope we're not having those conversations 10 years from now. It's how are we now employing the use of technology, of TikTok, interactive PDFs, Instagram, things like that for learning results.
Because you talk about user-generated content, so do you think that if those employees or the people that joined this project, that it kind of enhanced their self-efficacy?
Yes. So I'll give you a great example. There was a study here. So Marriott Hotels, as an example here, implemented a continuous learning and improvement leadership process, and they did it over 2 years. So what they were doing was they were introducing a topic. You name the topic, right? And so for 1 month, all the leaders would focus on that particular topic and integrating that topic into the daily lives of the hotels, the resorts, whatever it was that they were actually responsible for running. They implemented that process. So they had a peer mentor. They had a coach, right? They had meetups and channels in which they were now coming to roundtables with their other peers who were also doing the same thing. And they were sharing their experiences, their successes, their failures, their best practices, all this. And what Marriott saw over that 2-year period of time of now creating this idea of user-generated content and innovation and fail fast was over a 240% increase in profits over 2 years, because it wasn't that one and done. It wasn't a course. It was, we are constantly going to reinforce these topics in our daily work, whatever those things may be. And it was fascinating to read this, because at that time, ironically, I was in the hospitality industry, and I'm reading this and I'm sharing this with the CEO and the executive team. And it actually helped me sell the idea of the leadership framework that I was building, because now they were looking at a peer, a competitor, and they're like, oh, maybe we do need to think about things differently than what we were doing, which was those courses and workshops.
Yes, if one starts, the rest is just following, I guess.
It sure does, doesn't it?
And because we talk a lot about how you help other organizations and people to improve learning, just out of curiosity, what are your favorite learning formats? How do you learn the best? Is it also something like TikTok or YouTube, or is it something totally different?
Yeah, you know what? It's all of those. So I will say, it's funny. 3 years ago, if you had asked me about TikTok, I probably would have looked at you with a big question mark on my face. My children, so I have 2 daughters in college and one who's a senior in high school, introduced me to TikTok. And it was very topic specific. I was challenged with something at work at the time, and they said, oh, you should see this guy talk about this. And so they showed me the TikTok, and it wasn't, there was some kind of association with the topic that I was challenged with, but I could see the use of that tool, because that was actually the workforce that I was dealing with, was the, late teens to early 20-something group. That was where my challenge was with what we were doing, because again, it was within the hospitality industry. So it struck that chord with me as, okay, what tools are you using that I should probably be now integrating into that? So I kind of stepped back and started watching these TikTok videos from the sense of, okay, how are you now producing this content? What is the message that you're trying to deliver and things like that? So you have to think through of, okay, what are they now trying to convey to that individual? How do I now utilize the same technology to do that? So now you're thinking in 2-3 minute bursts of, I want to introduce you to something. So the learning for me was, again, utilizing those tools like TikTok, Instagram, even LinkedIn Learning, is how do I now create these multiple channels of learning for that individual, that they might see that video and say, okay, I want to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe there's a YouTube video as an example that will tell me a little bit more about this. And okay, where can I join a community of practice with other people who are now doing the same thing? So now we start thinking about LinkedIn groups as an example of that. And where can I get those resources that I need for that moment of need as well when I'm actually trying to do this work? So the part for me, in addition to those technologies, was making sure that there was practice. So I had to be very thoughtful about when I was implementing those topics or those ideas. As an example, was I needed to give them work to go do in that environment, and that they had to be committed enough to report back on that. But what I found was on that end, much like those TikTok videos I was sharing earlier, is they wanted to come back and share because it was a safe environment. It was like, we don't care if you fail. We expect you to fail. We want to understand how you failed and what we can do to improve on that. What do you need to now help you grow? Because sometimes that failure had nothing to do with the individual or their work. It was the ecosystem was holding them back.
I think this is a good way to sum up what we have been talking about. It was very inspirational, and I got amazing insights of what you have been doing so far, and also in your own personal way of learning. So thank you a lot for that, Joe. And great to have you here.
Thank you, Cinnamon. It has been my pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this podcast. We hope you liked it and come back to the next episode of Tell Me How You Learn.